The wind moved through the canyon like it carried stories too heavy to keep. It pressed against the red walls and came apart in low moans, scattering dust and memory alike. The sky above was the color of rusted iron, and the land below looked as if it had forgotten rain ever existed. Silas Reed rode slow through the gulch, reins slack in one hand, his other resting lazy against the stock of his rifle. His hat brim cast a long shadow over eyes that had seen too much. He was a man accustomed to silence. It had followed him for years like a stray dog that wouldn't be shaken off. He didn't ride toward anything, not anymore. Men like him didn't chase fate. They waited for it to find them. It did that day. He spotted the figures near a bend of stone, two shapes huddled together against the rock. From a distance, they looked like wind-blown brush or maybe an animal carcass left to the buzzards. But one of the shapes moved, barely. A tremor of an arm, the flutter of breath. Silas swung down from the saddle, boots grinding dry shale. His horse, Sage, snorted behind him, tail swishing at flies. The closer he came, the clearer the scene became. A woman lay there, stiff and sunken, her hair plastered to her temples, her skin gone gray. Her arms were curved around a smaller body. A girl, thin as wire. Her cheek pressed into the woman's side. Silas crouched, his shadow falling over them. The girl blinked. Her lips were cracked white, and her breath rasped shallow in her chest. "Hey there," he said softly. His voice rasped from disuse. "You hurt?" Her eyes opened wider, slow as dawn. She tried to speak, but no sound came. When she did manage, it was a thread of air. She won't wake up. Silas looked down at the woman again. Fever by the look of her. Gone at least a day, maybe two. He'd seen it before, sweat dried on skin, lips blistered from thirst. He exhaled through his nose, slow. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl swallowed. "Anna," he nodded once. "All right, Anna." He could have left her. Should have, maybe. "Ride on. Find the sheriff in the next town. Hand off the duty to men with clean consciences and better hearts." He'd done that once before, years ago, and the memory still burned. She didn't cry. Didn't plead. Just stared up at him with eyes that were too old for her years. Eyes that knew loss and expected nothing more from the world. And in that still moment, Silas wasn't standing in the canyon anymore. He was back on the dirt floor of a long-gone house, holding his sister Clara as her breathing rattled to a stop. His father's boots had walked away that same night, and his mother's voice had turned to dust not long after. Silence had been his inheritance ever since. He blew out a long breath, stood and scanned the land for a patch of earth soft enough to dig. He found one beside a cluster of mesquite and went to work. The shovel he carried in his saddlebag wasn't much, but it did the job. The dirt came up dry like it didn't want to be moved. When he was done, he wrapped the woman in her shawl and laid her in the earth with as much dignity as the desert would allow. He crossed himself out of old habit, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. When he turned back, the girl was still watching him. "You come on," he said. She didn't move. "I ain't asking twice." He lifted her easily. She weighed less than his bedroll. In her hand, she clutched something. A ragged doll with its face worn off, nothing left but a smear of thread where eyes once were. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she closed her eyes. Silas set her on Sage's back, mounted up behind her, and started toward the far ridge where the land broke into open plain. The canyon stretched wide around them, the world vast and empty, but it didn't feel that way. Not to him, not anymore. They rode through the evening light, shadows climbing up the red walls like ghosts returning home. The air smelled faintly of iron and rain that would never come. He kept one hand on the reins and the other around the girl's waist to steady her. She was silent. But after a while, her small hand found the edge of his coat and held on. By the time they reached his camp, the sun had bled out over the horizon. His lean-to crouched beside a creek that whispered faintly through the rocks. He dismounted, carried her down and laid her on a bedroll near the fire pit. The wind had picked up again, dry and restless. He stoked the fire until it caught and spread warmth across her face. She stirred but didn't wake. He covered her with a spare blanket, tore a strip from his shirt, dipped it in creek water, and pressed it against her lips. She drank weakly, almost surprised by the taste. Silas sat back on his heels, watching the flames twist in the wind. He didn't know why he'd done it, why he hadn't just ridden on like he always did. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him without asking for a thing. Maybe it was that old guilt he thought had died years ago. He chewed on a strip of jerky, the salt biting his tongue, and looked out into the dark canyon where the grave lay hidden. The world was quiet except for the fire's small crackle and the slow rhythm of the girl's breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, more to the night than to her. "You got a name?" he murmured. "And you got breath. From now on, you got me." The wind sighed through the canyon, soft as a promise no one else would ever hear. Winter came like a slow knife, cutting the color out of the land one breath at a time. By November, the canyon had turned brittle and pale. The wind no longer whistled. It moaned through the rocks like something ancient remembering its grief. Snow didn't fall fast in those parts. It drifted, hesitant, flake by flake, until the world went quiet beneath its weight. Silas Reed did not mind the cold. He'd lived through worse, winters where frost crawled down his beard and hunger gnawed his ribs. But that year was different. That year, he wasn't the only soul on the mountain. Anna Lee stayed mostly silent in the weeks after he found her. She spoke only when he asked a direct question, and even then, her voice came small, like it had to pass through too many ghosts before it reached her mouth. He didn't press her. A man who lived long with silence learned to treat it like a living thing, fragile, unpredictable, sacred. He built her a small shack beside his cabin, using scavenged boards from an old rail cart he'd hauled up from the valley. The thing wasn't much. 4 walls, a door that stuck, and a stove that smoked more than it burned. But it held the wind out, and that was enough. The first night she slept there, he stood outside listening. The wind howled across the ridge and snow swept in dry bursts against the roof. Inside, she was still. He almost called out, but didn't. Instead, he pulled his coat tighter, turned, and went back to his own fire. Days passed into one another, slow and hard. Anna rose early, wrapped in his old wool blanket, and sat near the pen where the calves were kept. She watched him mend fences, haul water, fix the roof. She didn't ask to help. She only watched, arms around her knees, her eyes following his hands like she was memorizing the world, one motion at a time. Sometimes, when he came back from checking the traps, he'd find his coffee cup washed and set neatly by the basin. His boots, once scattered by the door, were lined up straight. The firewood was stacked higher than before. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. Things got done, and that was the language they spoke. At night, when the sky pressed black against the window, Silas could hear faint sounds through the wall between their cabins, the quiet scratch of pencil on paper, the rustle of pages. He'd given her an old leather-bound notebook he'd found in a storage chest, blank, except for a few water stains. She'd taken to it like it was a friend. He never saw what she wrote, but he could tell it steadied her. The scratching of her pencil was a heartbeat in the quiet. One evening, a hard wind came down from the north, the kind that sounded like a growl. Silas had just finished tying the shutters when he noticed smoke puffing wrong from the pipe of Anna's shack, backflowing instead of drawing. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the storm. The snow bit at his face, but he didn't slow. When he opened her door, the heat hit him first, thick and wrong. The stove was belching smoke, the fire choked out. Anna was twisted beneath her blankets, skin glistening with sweat. Her breath came in sharp, broken pulls. Her face burned red, eyes glassy with fever. "Damn it," Silas muttered, rushing forward. He scooped her up, she was burning like a coal, and carried her through the snow into his own cabin. The storm howled behind him, swallowing the door as he kicked it shut. He laid her on his cot, tore off his gloves and soaked a rag in cold water. "Come on, girl," he murmured, pressing the cloth to her forehead. Her lashes fluttered. A small sound escaped her throat. Not quite a word, more like a plea. Silas worked through the night. He boiled water, changed the cloths, and fed the stove until his arms ached. When she shook, he held her shoulders still. whispering nonsense just to fill the silence. When her breathing slowed, he found himself praying, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. Sometime near dawn, she moaned softly, her voice raw and cracked. "Clara?" Silas froze. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Clara, his sister. Dead at 13. He leaned close, his voice shaking for the first time in decades. "No," he whispered. "Not Clara, it's Silas. You're safe." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Then they closed again. He stayed beside her long after her fever broke. Watched the color creep back into her cheeks. When her breathing steadied, he finally let himself sit back. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. But the exhaustion didn't matter. Something inside him had shifted, subtle as thawing ice. By mid-morning, the storm had blown itself out. He went outside, shovel in hand, and cleared a path to the barn, fists tight around the handle. He didn't cry. He didn't know how anymore. But his throat felt heavy, as if something had uncoiled in him he couldn't name. When he returned to the cabin, Anna was still asleep, her hair damp against her forehead. On the stool beside her lay a folded blanket and a tin cup of water. Next to it, in his rough, blocky handwriting, a note, "No more sleeping cold. You stay here now." So when she woke that evening and found it, she stared at the paper for a long time, then quietly, she reached for the notebook and wrote something new across a clean page. She didn't show it to him, but if she had, he might have seen 6 words that would come to define the rest of their lives. "He saved me. Now I save him." When the fever left her, it did so gently, like a ghost stepping backward through a doorway. One moment Anna burned with the heat of delirium, the next her skin cooled and the tremor faded from her lips. Morning light slid between the cabin boards, thin and golden, catching the dust that floated above her in slow circles. Silas sat slumped in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, eyes hollowed from the long night. The rag in his hand had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't noticed. His body felt carved out, his mind fixed only on the shallow rise and fall of her chest. He hadn't realized he was praying until the prayer stopped. When she finally stirred, a soft sound broke from her throat. Not pain exactly, just the first proof that life had returned. Silas straightened, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're all right now." Her gaze drifted toward him, unfocused, pupils wide like a fawn's. For a heartbeat she looked afraid, then she saw who it was, and exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. "You stayed," she whispered. "Didn't have anywhere better to be." The words came out rougher than he meant. He looked away, embarrassed by the truth hiding under them. She tried to smile, but the effort cracked her lips. He dipped the rag again, pressed it to her mouth. "Drink slow." She obeyed, eyes never leaving him. For 2 days, he kept her in his cabin. The fire burned round the clock, and the walls smelled of smoke and boiled cloth. When she finally stood on her own, pale and trembling, he made her eat a bowl of thin stew. She finished every drop without complaint. Afterward, she sat by the window, wrapped in his blanket, watching snow slide from the roof. "You could have let me be," she said softly. "Would have been easier. Maybe." He stirred the coals with a stick. "But I'm not much for easy." Something passed between them then, a small, fragile thing that neither dared name. It wasn't gratitude exactly, more like recognition. They were 2 people left behind by the same kind of storm. That night, when she slept again, Silas found himself studying her face by firelight. Fever had hollowed her cheeks, but beneath the exhaustion he saw something steady, determined. The same look Clara used to wear when she tried to hide she was afraid. He reached out once, almost brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, then stopped himself. "Not again," he murmured. "Not this time." He turned back to the window, to the cold sky split by the line of the ridge. The weeks that followed carried the hush of a truce. The worst of winter had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. Anna regained her strength slowly, moving about the cabin as though learning it by heart, where the kettle hung, which board squeaked near the door, how to coax the stove into heat. She still didn't talk much, but her silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like peace. One morning she appeared outside with a broom nearly as tall as she was, sweeping snow off the porch. Silas watched her from the barn, hiding a smile. "Don't waste your strength," he called. "Not wasting," she said, voice steady for the first time. Making room. He didn't ask what for. Maybe she didn't know herself. At night she wrote again in the notebook, the one he'd given her. Sometimes when he stepped outside to check the horses, he could see candlelight flickering through the crack in her door, the tip of her pencil moving quick. He never looked closer. Some things were better left untouched, and yet he found himself thinking about those pages. What words she might spill there. Did she write about her mother? The trail, him? The thought made him uneasy, though he couldn't have said why. Spring crept back timidly, melting the drifts into thin ribbons of water that hissed through the grass. The first birds returned to the trees near the creek, their calls sharp and hopeful. Life, it seemed, was stubborn. One afternoon, Silas came back from hunting with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder and found Anna sitting by the fire, sewing something from an old shirt of his. The light caught the edge of her hair. It gleamed like honey. She looked up, startled, then smiled shyly. "It was torn," she said. "I thought I could fix it." He nodded, throat too tight for words. The stitches were uneven but careful, each one placed like a promise. When supper was done, she pushed the mended shirt toward him across the table. "You should wear it," she said. "I will," he answered, though he didn't, not yet. He folded it instead, laid it on the shelf above his cot. For reasons he couldn't name, it felt like something sacred. That night, when she'd gone to her own bed, Silas sat long by the fire. He could still hear her soft humming through the wall, a tune with no words. It wound around him like smoke, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight inside him shift, just enough to breathe. He took the mended shirt down, ran his fingers over the crooked stitches, and smiled. Maybe, he thought, some things were worth breaking and fixing both. Outside, the last of the snow melted under a bruised sky, and the creek began to sing again. Time passed the way it always did in the high country, not in days but in seasons. Snow, then mud, grass, then dust, the creek swelling and shrinking like a lung that never stopped breathing. 3 winters came and went, and Anna Lee grew from a thin, frightened girl into a young woman with the kind of strength that didn't ask to be noticed. Her hands learned the rhythm of work, chopping wood, mending harness, tending to the horses as if they were kin. Her laughter, when it came, was low and soft, but it filled the empty corners of Silas Reed's cabin the way sunlight filled the cracks in old boards. He wasn't sure when she stopped being a child in his eyes. Maybe the morning he came back from the ridge and found her leading the bay mare, calm and sure, her braids swinging against her shoulder. Maybe the night she sang by the fire, voice thin as smoke but steady. Or maybe it was quieter than that. 1,000 small moments strung together until one day he looked up and saw what had changed. He told himself it was pride. Pride in how she'd survived, how she'd built herself out of loss and willpower. But the truth lay heavier than that. By the 4th summer, the land around them had begun to heal. The wildflowers came early, painting the slopes with yellow and violet. Silas built a new fence line along the creek. Anna helped drive the posts, her palms blistering, her eyes bright with determination. "You don't have to prove anything," he said once, seeing the raw cuts on her hands. She smiled without looking up. "Maybe not, but I can still try." He almost laughed, but stopped himself. She wasn't joking. There was a fierceness in her now, quiet but unyielding. It made something in his chest ache. Pride. Yes, but also fear. That night, while she slept, he took the half-finished fence post she'd carved her initials into, AL burned deep with a hot nail, and buried it under the porch. He didn't know why, only that he couldn't bear to see it every morning. When she turned 18, she asked him to teach her to shoot. "Why?" he asked. "Ain't much worth aiming at out here." "For when there is," she said simply. He tried to refuse, but her gaze didn't waver. So he took her down to the wash one afternoon, the sun low and heavy. He placed the rifle in her hands, guided her stance, felt the tremor of her breath against his arm. The scent of her hair, clean, faintly of pine smoke, caught him off guard. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't fight it. Let the weight do the work." She exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the canyon. She missed, but only barely. She turned, laughing, her eyes bright, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. The sound of that laughter, free, unguarded, undid him. He turned away, pretended to adjust the sights. "You'll get it next time," he said, voice too tight. When she looked at him, something unspoken lingered between them. He felt it, and he hated himself for it, for being a man still tethered to the past, for wanting something he had no right to want. That night he drank more than usual, sitting outside beneath the stars until the bottle ran dry. The sky above was endless, and yet it felt too close. He'd spent his life keeping things out, grief, love, hope, and now he didn't know how to keep them from getting in. The years deepened their quiet rhythm. They spoke less but understood more. When storms came, they waited them out together. When supplies ran low, they rode to town side by side, drawing curious eyes but saying nothing of who they were to each other. People talked, of course. They always did. A man his age, a girl half his life. It was a story the plains loved to chew on. But the distance of the mountain kept most tongues from reaching them, and the few who did found little to gossip about. Silas treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. She, in turn, looked at him as if he were the only fixed thing in a world that kept shifting. It should have been enough. Maybe it was. One evening, when the summer storms had just begun to break, Anna stood by the window, her notebook open on the table. The rain came soft against the roof, the kind that made the air smell of iron and new life. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He looked up. "Leaving what?" "This." She gestured at the cabin, the hills beyond it. "All of it," he shook his head. "Ain't much waiting for me anywhere else." She smiled faintly. "Maybe there's more waiting than you think." He didn't answer. Instead, he watched her reflection in the window, the curve of her cheek, the way her hair fell loose down her back. The sight of her made something inside him twist, tender and painful. That night, he dreamed of Clara again, his sister, small and pale, standing by the creek. She looked at him with eyes too wise for her years and said, "You can't keep everyone alive, Silas." When he woke, his pillow was damp, though he hadn't known he'd been crying. As summer turned toward autumn, the air changed. The nights grew sharper, and so did the silence between them. He began to notice small things, the way her voice softened when she said his name, the touch lingering just a second too long when she handed him a plate, the faint smell of her hair when she passed. It wasn't wrong, not yet. But it wasn't innocent anymore either. He started finding excuses to ride out alone, to the ridge, to the valley, anywhere that let him breathe. But every time he came back, she was there waiting. The lamp lit, supper warm, the sight of her undoing all the distance he'd tried to build. It was only a matter of time before the silence broke, and when it did, neither of them would ever be the same. Autumn came dressed in copper and smoke. The aspens along the ridge burned gold for a week and then turned bare overnight, their leaves skittering down the valley like coins spent too fast. The air smelled of wood fire and frost. The horse's breath hung white in the dawn. Life at the cabin settled into its small, steady rituals. Chop wood, feed stock, patch the roof where the wind clawed through. Silas liked the order of it, the way work kept his thoughts in line. But order was only good until something small slipped loose. It happened one evening after rain, while he was sweeping mud from the porch. Through the open door, he saw her notebook on the table, its leather cover curled from heat, a ribbon marking the page. She was outside gathering kindling, humming to herself. He told himself not to look. He'd never once read a word of it. But the wind flipped the book open, and a page lifted, the handwriting dark against the paper. He meant only to close it. Instead, his eyes caught a line before he could look away. "He thinks he saved me." Maybe he did. But it's him I keep alive now, every time I smile at the silence between us. Silas froze. The broom slipped from his hand, clattering against the boards. Another gust turned the page. I dream sometimes that he touches my hair the way the wind does, gentle, afraid to linger. If he knew what I felt, he'd ride away and never stop. He shut the book fast, the sound sharp in the quiet room. His pulse beat heavy in his ears. He felt suddenly older than his years, tired, ashamed, confused. He wanted to blame curiosity, fate, anything but himself. Yet there was no undoing what he'd read. Outside, Anna's footsteps approached. He stepped away from the table, forcing his breath to even out. When she entered, cheeks flushed from the cold, she smiled at him the way she always did, open, unguarded. "You all right?" She asked. "Fine," he said too quickly. "Just thinking." She set the wood by the stove. The room filled with the sound of tinder catching. He watched her in the firelight, her face lit gold, her hands steady, and knew that the ground beneath them had changed forever. He just didn't know how to stand on it. That night he couldn't sleep. The storm had moved east, leaving the sky stripped bare and full of stars. He sat by the window, the notebook in his hands. He hadn't meant to take it, but when she'd gone to bed, he'd carried it out with him like a man carrying proof of a crime. He read more, lines that trembled between confession and prayer. "He calls me girl still. Maybe it's mercy, maybe it's a cage. When he looks away, I can breathe again. But I miss the weight of his eyes. If love is sin, then I've been damned since the day he found me." He shut the book, heart hammering. He wanted to burn it, throw it in the fire and let the ashes scatter. But his hands wouldn't move. Instead, he walked out into the night, crossed the yard and left it on her doorstep. By morning, she was gone. He found her tracks by the creek, small prints leading south toward the ridge. The notebook lay open in the mud, soaked through, the ink bleeding down the pages. A few words still showed clear. "I'm sorry." Silas mounted up without breakfast, the world narrowing to the trail ahead. The wind bit hard at his face. Clouds rolled over the peaks like smoke. She was fast on foot, but the storm was faster. By midday, sleet began to fall. He followed her trail through the timber until it vanished in snow. For a moment he thought she'd turn back. Then he saw a scrap of her shawl snagged on a thorn bush and knew better. "Damn it." "Anna," he muttered, spurring the horse forward. He found her near sundown, huddled beneath an outcrop of rock, arms wrapped around her knees. Her lips were blue, her breath shallow. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't move, just stared, like she'd expected this moment and feared it all the same. "Why'd you run?" he said, dropping to his knees beside her. "You read it," she whispered. It wasn't a question. He wanted to lie, but the truth was all he had left. "I did. Then you know." Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean for you to—" "I know what I read," he cut in. "But you don't understand what it means." She looked at him, eyes bright with tears that froze before they fell. "It means I love you, Silas, and you can't even stand to hear it." The words hit like a bullet through the ribs. He reached for her, then stopped himself halfway. "Anna, you don't know what you're saying. I do. I've known for years." She drew a shuddering breath. "You think I stayed here because I owed you? I stayed because you're the only thing that feels like home." He closed his eyes. The storm hissed around them, snow finding every seam in his coat. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "You were a child when I found you." "I'm not anymore. That don't make it right." "Then what does?" she asked, and the question hung between them, heavy as the gray sky. He couldn't answer. He could only pull his coat around her, lift her trembling body into his arms and whisper, "We'll talk when you're warm." She didn't resist. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath hot through the damp fabric of his shirt. He carried her back through the snow as the light bled out of the world. By the time they reached the cabin, night had swallowed everything. He set her by the fire, stripped off her wet boots, wrapped her in blankets. She wouldn't look at him. He wanted to speak, say something kind, or true or both, but all that came was silence. Outside, the wind raged against the walls. Inside, the air between them was worse. That night, Silas lay awake on the floor beside the dying fire. He could hear her breathing from the cot, slow, steady now, safe. The storm began to ease, leaving only the drip of melting snow from the roof. He stared into the ashes and whispered to no one, "I don't know how to love you right." Morning came pale and fractured. The storm had wandered off east, leaving behind a world-washed roar. Every branch was glazed in ice, every blade of grass bent low under the weight of the night's fury. The creek roared thick with meltwater, brown and wild. Silas woke to the hush after chaos, the kind that makes a man afraid to breathe. Anna still slept, curled tight beneath his old wool blanket. Her face turned toward the faint warmth of the fire. A lock of her hair had fallen across her cheek. He almost reached to move it, then stopped himself. He went outside instead, needing the cold more than the comfort. The sky was wide and clean, too honest for lies. He crouched by the trough, splashed water over his face until his skin stung. His reflection looked older, harder, a man caught between what was right and what was real. When he came back inside, Anna was sitting up. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and she blinked against the thin morning light. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried every word they hadn't said. Finally she whispered, "You found me. You didn't leave me much choice. I wasn't running from you," she said, voice trembling. "I was running from what I'd done, writing those things, letting them live on paper. I was afraid they'd change everything." "They did," he said quietly. She looked down, the smallest of nods. "I thought so." Silas leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Anna, what you feel, what I feel, it ain't simple. It never was. I don't need simple," she said. "I just need truth." Her words landed like a match on dry grass. He took a long breath as if the act itself cost him. "Truth is, I've tried to keep a line between us so long I can't tell anymore which side I'm standing on." Anna's eyes lifted to his. "Then step over it." He stared at her, jaw tight, heart hammering against his ribs. "You don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do. I'm not that girl you found on the trail. I've lived with you, worked beside you, watched you carry the ghosts you never speak of." "You think I don't see you, Silas? I see everything." Her voice broke then, soft but certain. "And I still choose you." He moved before thought caught up, crossed the room in 2 strides, knelt in front of her. Hands shaking. "I've spent half my life burying the dead," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. "My sister, my parents, everyone I ever cared about. I told myself silence kept them safe inside me. But you," he stopped, breath catching. "You made me remember I'm still alive, and that scares the hell out of me." Anna reached for him, fingertips brushing the edge of his hand. "Then let it scare you. Just don't walk away from it." Silas looked at her like a man seeing sunlight after years underground. The wall he'd built between them, the one made of duty and guilt, cracked clean through. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched. For a long time, that was enough. No kiss, no promise. Just breath shared between 2 people who'd been too quiet for too long. Then, in a whisper, meant for no one else, he said, "I love you, Anna Lee." Her breath caught, her hands tightening around his. "Say it again." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen from him in years. "I love you." "God help me, I do." She exhaled a small, broken sound, half sob, half laugh, and leaned in until their lips met. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't rushed. It was the kind of kiss that feels like forgiveness, the kind that fills every empty space without asking permission. Outside, the thawing world began to sing again, dripping eaves. Restless wind, the first birds testing their voices. The sound folded around them like a benediction. When they finally pulled apart, the fire had burned low. Silas brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, eyes steady now. "You should know, loving me won't be easy." "I never asked for easy," she said, smiling through tears. "Just honest," he nodded, thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. "Then that's what you'll have." She leaned into his touch, the corners of her mouth soft. "What happens now?" Silas glanced toward the window, where sunlight spilled thin and gold across the frosted earth. "Now," he said, We see if the world's kind enough to let us keep this. And for the first time since the day he found her, he believed it might be. Spring came slow that year, as if the land itself had forgotten how to thaw. The snow shrank day by day, bleeding into the soil until green began to show again along the ridge. Calves stumbled on unsteady legs, and the creek lost its roar, finding its old calm whisper once more. Silas and Anna worked the thaw together, fixing fences, mending saddles, clearing brush from the path that led to the barn. There was a rhythm to it, the kind that doesn't need talking. She'd pass him a nail before he asked. He'd pour her coffee before she reached for the pot. Nothing between them had changed, and yet everything had. The air felt easier now, their silences no longer weighted with what if. Sometimes she'd hum while cooking, some tune half-remembered from her childhood, and he'd stop whatever he was doing just to listen. At night, they sat by the fire, two shadows on the same wall, comfortable in the same quiet. He still called her Anna instead of Kid, and that small shift carried more truth than any vow could. They never spoke of what lay beyond the hills. But the world had a way of finding you, even when you'd stopped looking for it. It began with dust, a thin gray plume on the horizon, rising where no rider should have been. Silas spotted it first while working the corral. He shaded his eyes, watching 3 figures crest the ridge, riders moving with purpose. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low, turning the world amber and cruel. The man in front wore a long coat and a badge tarnished by years of wind. His face was sharp, his tone official. "Silas Reed?" Silas nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's right." The man dismounted slowly, boots crunching dry earth. "Name's McHale, county magistrate. Got word there's a young woman living here with you." Silas's jaw tightened. "That so?" The deputy behind McHale snorted. "Looks true enough to me." Anna stood in the doorway, arms crossed, chin lifted. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't step back. "She's my family," Silas said. "She got papers?" McHale asked. "No." "Then she ain't your family in the eyes of the law." Silas's voice dropped low. "Law ever ask what the eyes of a man see?" McHale didn't flinch. "Not my concern what you see, Reed. Folks talk. Word gets out you're keeping a girl here. No kin, no church blessing, no name on record. Some might not take kindly to that." Anna spoke before Silas could. "I'm not a girl," she said. "And I don't belong to anyone but myself." McHale turned his gaze to her, frowning. "You schooling out here?" "I teach," she said. "Children from the homesteads up north?" "Ones who got no place else to learn." McHale's brows lifted a little, as if that truth didn't fit what he'd been told. He looked back to Silas. "I'll give you this. You've done no harm by the sound of it. But don't bring her into town. Don't stir up what don't need stirring." Silas's tone cooled. "Meaning what?" "Meaning people see things the way they want to see them," the man said. "And out here, that can turn bad quick. Keep to yourselves, and you'll keep the peace." He tipped his hat, signaled to his men, and turned his horse toward the trail. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the sound of hooves until the prairie was quiet again. Silas stood there a long while, watching the horizon empty. The sun dipped behind the hills, dragging the light with it. Anna came down the porch steps and stood beside him. What did he mean, keep to ourselves? He exhaled, slow and heavy. "Means folks like to judge what they don't understand." "And they don't understand us, do you?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I do now." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his, a gesture small but defiant. "Then let them talk." Silas nodded once. "Let them." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. He turned toward the cabin, but she didn't move. Her gaze followed the path the riders had taken until the dust was gone. "I used to dream of belonging somewhere," she said. "Now I know it isn't a place. It's a person." Silas squeezed her hand. "You belong right where you're standing," and she smiled, faint but certain. "Then I'm home." The rain came that night, soft and steady. It beat against the windows like the land itself was washing clean the whispers that had followed them. Silas sat by the fire, Anna's head resting on his shoulder, their hands twined. "Think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. But if they do, they'll find nothing to take. Outside, thunder rolled far off, low and tired. The storm was moving on, and so were they. For the first time in years, Silas felt something close to peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that's built when two people stop running from what's true. Years do not pass the same in the high country. They move slower, like the river in midsummer, full but unhurried. By the time a decade had come and gone, the sharp edges of the world had worn smooth for Silas Reed and Anna Lee. The cabin still stood, a little more bowed under weather, its roof patched with mismatched boards. The porch sagged, but it held. The fields had grown thick with grass, and the apple tree Silas planted behind the barn now leaned under the weight of fruit each fall. Sometimes travelers still passed through. Traders, lost riders, men looking for work or shelter from the sudden storms. They'd eat, sleep, and move on. Some asked if the two were married. Others didn't bother. Silas never offered explanation, and Anna never felt the need. They belonged to no law but their own. On warm mornings, Anna would walk to the river with her notebook under her arm. She still wrote, not about love now, but about the quiet, the shape of clouds over the ridge, the way light shifted through cottonwoods, the sound of Silas's hammer from the barn. Her handwriting had grown steadier over the years, her words surer. One afternoon she sat by the water while Silas mended a fence nearby. The river ran clear and slow, sunlight fracturing across it like scattered glass. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked suddenly. Silas didn't look up from his work. "No reason to? You used to talk about the world past the ridge. Talk's easy. I've seen what's out there." He drove another nail, the steady rhythm of it marking time. "Everything I ever needed found me right here." She smiled at that, soft and knowing. "You sound like an old man." "Maybe I am one." "You're not," she said, setting the notebook aside. "You just got old young." He looked up then, caught her gaze. And for a heartbeat they were the same as they'd been that first spring after the storm. Her eyes bright with life, his filled with a kind of quiet awe. As seasons folded over one another, the years grew gentler. The cabin filled with small, ordinary things, a second chair by the hearth, a stray cat that never left, the sound of laughter when the wind blew wrong and carried echoes from the valley. In town, folks still spoke their names now and then, half rumor, half legend. "That woman who stayed with Reed up in the hills," they'd say. No preacher, no papers. Just the two of them and the land, but time dulled even gossip. People learned to let their story be what it was, a simple, stubborn kind of love. Late one evening, when the first frost returned, Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his old knife. The room glowed amber and quiet. Anna sat across from him, reading aloud from a book of poems she'd traded for in town. Her voice, still low and clear, filled the cabin like a familiar hymn. When she finished, she looked over and smiled. "You're not listening." "I am," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "How strange it is that peace can feel so heavy, like it's something you've got to hold steady or it slips away." She closed the book and went to him, laying a hand on his shoulder. "It's not heavy," she said. "It's full." "That's all." He reached up, covering her hand with his. "You always find the right words." "That's because you gave me quiet enough to hear them." He chuckled softly. "Guess that's something I could give." "It was everything," she said, and leaned down to kiss the top of his head. The first snow came early that year. Silas stood by the door at dawn, watching it fall, silent, endless, gentle. Anna came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Cold?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." They stayed like that for a long time, two shadows against the light. The world outside washed clean and white. In the spring that followed, the river flooded its banks, carrying with it pieces of branch and bark, all the broken things winter had left behind. Anna sat on the porch, listening to it rush. The air smelled of thaw and earth. Silas came to sit beside her, his hair more gray now than black. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The river moved on, and so did they. Together, quietly, the way they always had. And when the day came that one of them would walk on alone, the other would know where to look, down by the water, where time runs slow, where love, once found, never truly leaves.